I was a guest on the radio program Family Life Today 4 times. Now, the 4th time I was on, sitting next to me was my pastor and dear friend, Adam Tyson. I was there to talk about a new film I directed. Adam was there to talk about this massive celebrity that had been attending our church. Why do I bring this up? Because there were a lot of moving parts. But guiding the conversation on air was none other than Bob Lepine. Bob is the longtime co-host of Family Life, as well as just a legend of Christian radio. He's interviewed thousands of people, so it was super cool to turn the mics around and for me to interview Bob. He's a dear friend and mentor. Hope you enjoy our time. Talk about worlds colliding for me. Here we are at Kappa Studios.
Right.
For those who may not know you, what would you say, what are you most known for? How would you answer that?
So for 28 years, I was the co-host of a radio program, a syndicated radio program called Family Life Today. People know the name Dennis Rainey.
Sure.
If they know that, they go, oh, you were that other guy.
Is that right? They still think of you as the other guy, huh? Wow.
Somebody introduced us one time and forgot his name, and it was like, this
Okay,
Bob
there you
Lepine,
go.
and
Yeah.
I was like, I've
Fair
waited
enough.
all my life for this to happen. But no, Dennis was the host of the program. I was the co-host, and
Got
so
it.
had the chance to work with him for 26 of those 28 years, and then David Ann Wilson came in and slid into his spot, and I worked with them for a couple of years. So if folks know the name, that's typically how they know it.
Sure. Now, on that note, I was interviewed 4 times on your show as a film director. It was clearly a slow news week, or what is it, news cycle.
So we had No Greater Love that came out. We had you out
and you
to
did
talk
2
about it.
episodes on that, believe it or not.
Right.
Can you believe that?
Right, I do believe that.
Yeah.
Because, again, the message of the movie was in sync with what we were doing.
Sure.
And then I was like, they're great guys. They're trying to do good stuff. And so when Grace Unplugged, right?
Yes, that's right. That's
that
right.
came out, I actually did a site visit.
Yes, you
a
did.
set visit in John Irwin's house in Birmingham, right?
Gosh, you have an incredible memory.
Drove
Yes.
over to Birmingham, watched you do the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so we came back and we said, there's a parenting theme in this movie. There's a how do you handle your daughter when she's going off the rails kind of thing. So it fit the family life messaging. So that came out. That went theatrical.
Correct.
Because
Correct.
No Greater Love never went to theaters.
Right.
So here you're going from video on demand to theatrical. Your star is on the rise.
It's hard to believe the skyrocketing career that was my directorial career.
Yes.
Now, to fast forward, the 4th time you interviewed me on Family Life, I needed to pull out. I knew I was out of bullets so I had to do something very, very special. We had to convince Kanye West to start coming to our church. By that time, Dennis was already retired.
Yes.
And it was good. That's how, man, so many stories.
This is to talk about the movie Selfie Dad.
Correct, Selfie Dad.
And we were friends with Michael Jr., who we
Yes.
had done events with. He had, in fact, in the Art of Parenting video series that we did, Michael does a number of improv
Got
bits
it.
with an audience. Just great stuff. So I've always loved Michael. And so here you are working on a movie where he is the lead.
Right.
And Selfie Dad, once again, we're in the marriage and family
Correct.
space.
Right.
I'd actually been out here. I heard about Selfie Dad because I'd come to Kappa.
Yeah, we shot it before you came, I think.
I came to Kappa,
Yeah.
and I was working on the movie Like Arrows that
Yes.
we produced for Family Life.
Yes.
And it was in the work that you guys were doing for Like Arrows that I heard about Selfie Dad and watched a screener, the first cut of it, here
Unbelievable.
in one of the screening rooms.
Unbelievable.
So I watched that, liked that, and said, yeah, we want to help support that.
He is the best.
And then you guys call and say, guess who's doing a song or who's got a song in the movie?
Right.
Like, who? Kanye. And this was right at the time when Kanye was kind of exploring, right?
Yeah,
And your
yeah.
pastor was meeting with him, discipling him, trying to figure out where, and we're all going, he's doing church services, going to cities and put on a full concert, and it's church. So we're all going, what's going on with Kanye?
And if you recall, Adam, part of the connection with Family Life was when Adam, his first public appearance with Kanye,
Was
and if
in
people don't know,
Detroit.
was in Detroit.
Yep.
With the former chaplain of the Detroit Lions, who happened to be
The host of Family Life Today, Dave Wilson. So that's where Dave met Adam backstage at church with Kanye. And then Adam comes out and does Family Life Today. So yeah, it was just all these worlds colliding and overlapping.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I look to you as you're so gifted at just knowing how to move a conversation along in a world where so many of us, and people do podcasts, people do video series like we're doing here. How did you learn how to be a radio host?
In a world where people
Yes.
don't know how to ask questions, how did you learn to ask them?
That's exactly what man, and even do it with a trailer voice. This is incredible.
You know, who was it? Malcolm Gladwell said, if you do 10,000 hours of anything, you'll become an outlier.
Got it.
So some of it is I did thousands of hours.
Just sheer, just
In 1985,
Yeah.
I was living in Sacramento.
Okay.
I was the general manager of a radio station in Sacramento. When I took over for the previous general manager, he said, hey, I want to tell you something. I've started doing a talk show every afternoon between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. It's really been good for the station. We've had lots of guests in. He said, I would encourage you to just keep that going.
okay.
And I thought, I'm the GM. The general manager of the station isn't usually a talk show host. But I took this guy's word for it. So I just jumped in the seat and started interviewing people in local radio in Sacramento. Interestingly enough, at the same time I was interviewing people in Sacramento in 1984, I was turning on this other local station where this guy was doing talk radio. And he'd monologue for like 20 minutes, never say, we're going to take a call or have a guest. It was so unusual. His name was Rush Limbaugh.
Ah,
Local guy.
whatever happened to him anyways, yeah.
So I'm listening to him, but I'm now a student of communicators.
I see.
Who does this well. So I just start watching.
So there's no training for this for you, Bob, necessarily. So you're in Sacramento. What was the format? What were the topics?
It was a Christian station.
Okay.
And we had you're in Sacramento, so we had state legislators on. We would talk about political issues. We would talk about theological issues.
So
Here's what
funny.
it was. What am I curious about? Let's book that guy. I mean, stop and think about the job I had for all these years. Who would I like to talk to about
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah.
Let's book him.
I mean, we're going back to you said 84, which I smirked when you said that. 84 in Sacramento, state legislators talking about theology. Now, you met my wife last night at dinner. She doesn't remember a time when California
Yes.
would have state legislators that wouldn't have.
Who would even know how to spell Jesus? Right.
And I'm like, honey, you don't understand. There was George Duke Machen and
Yeah,
Pete
right.
Wilson.
That's
And then
right.
there was obviously Reagan before them.
Right. The thing that we were all having to learn was that conservative and Bible aren't necessarily synonyms. Well, and Chuck Colson, when he was working in the Nixon White House, he tells a story. He said, we knew, now this was in his pre-Christian days, he said, we knew we could get Christian leaders and we could invite them to a dinner on the presidential yacht,
Okay.
go out onto the Potomac, and we could manipulate them to almost any
Wow.
cause we needed them. Proximity to power was seductive,
Goodness.
and just by appearing to care about what they cared about, they would respond. And he said we knew how to do that. We were good at manipulating people.
Wow.
in that regard. And I think Christians for so long, first of all, had not been particularly politically engaged, and then to feel like you have a voice and we value your voice. I think we got seduced.
Interesting.
And pretty quick, I remember listening to Christian pastors who were trying to explain why voting for this tax cut or for this appropriations bill, why this was something Christians should support.
Right.
And thinking, well, there's not really, I mean, I might be for that as a civil matter, but let's not make it a Christian matter. But that early on in the late 80s, early 90s, it was real easy to say
It's so fascinating.
Christians should be behind this
Yeah.
right-wing thing. And Republican Party recognized that's a voting bloc, a constituency. If we can court them, we can have them supporting our causes. Christians were saying we need to pull the moral pendulum back this direction. That's where the moral majority came from. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, big leaders in the moral majority.
Sure. This is in like the late 70s, 80s? Early 70s? What are we talking?
This is late 70s.
Okay.
1976, Jimmy Carter comes along and says, I'm a born-again Christian.
Right.
He's running against Gerald Ford, who's an Episcopalian. So in 1976, you've got a self-identified born-again Christian. And so when Carter gets elected, now you've got a born-again Christian who's your guy, but pretty soon the evangelicals are going, yeah, he's not taking us the direction we thought he should be taking us. The Republicans are coming along and said, that's not your guy. And so 76 to 80 is when the moral majority formed, and the election of Reagan in 1980 was kind of the first emergence of evangelicals as a voting bloc, that if you can move these people, you can move the election
I
in
see.
your direction.
Was Reagan sort of we are the majority, the blurring the line between politics and Christianity?
So I don't know that. I think what happened in there was that that evangelicals said this is the way in.
But okay, one last thought on that. I can't help myself. I can't help myself. I feel like we as Christians, instead of wanting to pray to the living God of all creation, we want to pray to Washington. We want to seek Washington to solve our problems instead of live radically depending on Christ as revealed in Scripture.
Right. Politics is not unimportant. Exercising, I've voted in every presidential election since I was able to, and think I have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm politically alert and aware, pay attention to this, because I do think that as a participant in a democracy where I'm invited to participate in it, I have a stewardship over that responsibility. But if I think that's ultimate, or if I think that that's where things are going to change, here's my latest example of this is for decades, I have hoped and prayed for Roe v. Wade to be overturned.
Yeah.
And it was last year. Has that fixed the abortion problem in our country? And the reason it hasn't fixed the abortion problem is because it doesn't affect hearts and minds.
Amen.
So does legislation follow culture or does it lead culture? I think it does both.
Okay.
So I think that legislators are looking around and going, where are the votes? We're going to lean that direction. But then the law has a pedagogical impact. When you say it's legal, when you say weed is legal, people go, I guess it must be okay.
Right.
Because it's legal, because when we think if something's legal, it must be okay.
Great point. There's a certain acceptance of it, sure.
So it's not that the law is unimportant, but the law doesn't change hearts and minds.
Right.
The purpose of the law is to set up that boundary, to be a check on our natural impulses. Here we are talking about political theory, right? But
I dig it.
But there are many people in our world today who would say if you can just give people education and opportunity, they will do the right thing. And then there are people who will say if you just give people freedom and get out of their way, they'll do the right thing. I say to both of those groups, people are not inclined to do the right thing.
My third group was going to be, and then there's a third group who reads Romans.
Right.
Sorry, keep going.
So because we're not inclined to do the right thing,
right,
we need some restraint and law around that. And then beyond that, we need liberty to be able to function.
You're a pastor now. I didn't realize it's been 16 plus years you've been a pastor?
Yeah. Well, I was a lay elder in a church in San Antonio when we were there. When we moved to Little Rock, we joined a church, and I ultimately became a lay elder in that church as well. Okay. And in my way of thinking, lay elders have a pastoral role and responsibility.
I believe that is biblical, yes.
Right. So I was not just on the board voting for budgets. I was involved in shepherding. But we planted a church 16 years ago where I took the lead role and was the primary teacher on Sunday morning. And among a group of 7 elders, I was the one with vision and direction for where we needed to go as a church.
Got it. So most of those 16 years, you were still obviously an on-air...
working at Family Life.
Working with Family Life.
Mm-hmm.
How many interviews do you think, going back to Sacramento in the early 80s, do you have a number in your head? You said, I did X amount of interviews. Do you have a ballpark? Have you even thought about it?
So after Sacramento, we moved to San Antonio, and I was on the air for 6 years there doing a daily call-in talk show. Okay. And it wasn't always interviews. Some days it was open lines today, call in, we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. But I would say if you take those times in local radio, so probably 7 years of local radio, and I didn't do it every day. Some days were reruns, I was out of town, guest host kind of thing. you've got 260 weekdays a year. So I probably did 500-600 interviews over that period of time.
Wow.
And yeah, and that's, I say 500 or 600, that may have been more like 1,000, somewhere in that number.
Okay.
You get to Family Life Today, 28 years of daily in and out, and we made it a goal that we were going to do fewer than 20% reruns in any given year.
Unbelievable.
So when we do an interview, some days we'd have somebody in and we'd do 3 days of programs with them. I think we calculated that there were probably 2,000 guests, give or take, and we probably recorded between 7,000 and 8,000 programs over that extended period of time.
Goodness. So you're talking in a minimum 3,000, or let's say 2,600 to 3,000 separate guests.
Yeah.
What did you learn in terms of, like, so many people just go on Facebook or Instagram, everybody's doing a podcast or something like this. Is there something that you look to and say, wow, that is a mistake people make, that is a good thing they're doing? Do you have opinions on what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, I've got somewhere in my computer, I've just some notes I've taken about interview basics.
Okay.
Just things like that you are driving the car as the interviewer.
Yes.
You should know where you're trying to get to.
Jonathan, make notes of this because sorry, keep going. Yeah.
And the guest is there. Now, the guest, as you're driving the vehicle and you know where you're trying to go, the guest may say, have you ever gone down this road? And you say, let's go down that road.
Yeah.
There might be a scenic turnout you take just to see what's down there. But at the end of the day, you're in the driver's seat.
Right.
You're trying to get from here to there. So the guest is there to follow your direction, and you know enough about the guest and what they're good at.
Sure.
You're going to a place that they know how to get you there. Who's the biggest podcaster around today? Give me a name. When I say podcast, you say...
First one in our Ben Shapiro. Let's use Ben Shapiro.
So Ben Shapiro. So
yes.
If Ben is interviewing guests...
Yes.
Do you care who he's interviewing?
He's bigger than the guest. Is that what you're getting at?
Joe Rogan...
is bigger than the guest.
So if Joe Rogan has Elon Musk on, it's like, oh, I want to hear that. But you want to hear that because of what Joe Rogan is going to ask Elon, because you know. So,
good point.
So that as a podcaster, you have to recognize people are listening to you. If they're listening to you, it's because the way you steer a conversation is something that they like the direction you take things.
I see, yes.
And then if you can bring in some big guest and they go, oh, I love that guest, I want to hear where you take them. And with that in mind, I try to be very graciously intrusive and nosy and find a way to ask the question that everybody's thinking without it being cringeworthy or embarrassing. So when we were interviewing Johnny and Ken Tata years ago...
Yeah, I already know the question you're going to ask.
Everybody in the audience, and we're talking about their marriage and how they started getting married, and I'm thinking she's paralyzed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what that means in terms of marital intimacy.
Yeah.
So a lot of people will think you can't ask that, and I'll say there's a way you can crack that door open and see if it's safe to go in there. And it's not by saying to somebody, so what was sex like for you guys? That would cause the audience to go, you just made me feel uncomfortable.
Right, sure.
That's that question.
A certain tact, a certain ability.
But if you say, one of the issues that's significant for a lot of couples is, and this is couples all across the board, regardless of what's going on. It may be health challenges, whatever, but marital intimacy is a factor.
Right.
What are you guys comfortable talking about how that's been for you?
Mm.
You've now opened the door to say, where are we going to go? And then you just see how comfortable are they.
Had you prepped them ahead of time for that?
No, we did very little prepping when we would sit down with a guest. But here's what we didn't want to do. I learned this early on. We would typically have lunch with a guest ahead of time before we'd sit down and record their interview, just to relax, have casual conversation.
Totally.
But we had to learn you don't talk over lunch about what you're going to talk about in the interview.
Why is that? Do you lose the freshness?
So the first time they tell it to you over lunch,
I see.
they're telling it to you like they know you don't know the story, so they're giving you the story.
I see. Yeah,
The
that makes a lot
second
of
time,
sense.
in their mind, they're thinking, we've already talked about this. They truncate the story. It's not as well told. So we would go in. I would sit down with somebody for lunch, and my first question was, what was your high school mascot? And I did that just to say, we're going to talk about relational, personal things. Sometimes they would just kind of naturally get into their content that we were going to be talking about. Well, this comes up in my book, and we go, stop, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. To take it back to the, 3 decades of family life.
Yeah.
That's the name of the ministry,
Right.
the name of the radio broadcast. What are the biggest issues that you saw come up over and over within family life?
In talking about marriage, in terms of the presenting issues that we saw most often, there was isolation that came around sexual issues. Oftentimes it's pornography on the part of the husband, or oftentimes it's just husbands and wives who are, for whatever reason, they're struggling in that area, in the area of intimacy in their marriage. I think a lot of that is because we're in a culture where sexual sin, first of all, we're in a culture where sexuality has been so emphasized. You come into marriage with this kind of being, it's like the biggest thing, and then it's naturally awkward, and it takes a long time for couples to figure out what all of that means. And then how do you deal with that delicately in a Christian formatted station, and what do you talk about and what don't you talk about?
So these are topics that are on air. You're saying, was this a special guest that you would bring on like once a week? Like, did you react that? Did you and Dennis over the years say like, okay, this is a big topic?
So we're going to keep coming back to it?
So we're going to keep coming back to it.
We came back to it when we felt like there was a fresh opportunity to do a fresh take or to hear a fresh voice on it. But we didn't feel like we've got to be addressing this once a month.
Yeah.
Or because there are plenty of issues.
Yeah,
the systemic issue is always pride. It's always sin. It's always the isolation that leads us in the wrong direction. So whatever the manifestation of that is, whether it's conflict over finances or conflict over job priorities or substance abuse or anxiety and depression, all of those things, we were looking and saying, here's what's being presented. What's at the spiritual core of this, and how do you find a spiritual remedy for what's presenting as the sinful pattern or the isolating pattern in a marriage relationship. And I'm just saying sexuality became a bigger issue because first of all, you had a lot of kids who grew up in homes where it was like, if you will just stay pure, everything will be fine. And then they got married and it wasn't all fine.
Right.
Then you had a lot of kids who grew up having been sexually abused, sexually violated, or sexually promiscuous, and they come into marriage with sexual baggage, and they're trying to make this work. And sexuality is a profound and deep part of our core. There's something profoundly spiritual about our sexuality.
Amen. Right.
And so it's kind of like when you start to get to that, you're getting below the surface to kind of what's at the root.
I would go as far as to say it is a form of worship.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's a means of glorifying God.
Sure.
When done biblically
Yeah.
in the construct of a biblical model. So this is so fascinating to me. This is sort of the open-endedness of this topic is so crazy.
God's good gift for marriage.
Right.
And think about it. So at the end of the first wedding ceremony, man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This, by the way, is the last act of creation.
Huh.
So when God has created everything, the man and the woman, he says, here's the last thing I'm going to create. I'm going to take two people, bring them together.
Amazing.
I'm going to make one flesh.
Yes.
Now I'm done.
Right.
I have finally finished the masterpiece. Why is that the masterpiece? Because when two become one, it pictures what has been the Trinitarian unity from all time.
Amazing.
So we now have a human picture of Trinitarian unity. So what does the enemy most want to destroy?
That core intimacy.
Exactly.
That core, yeah.
Right. So it's no surprise that that's going to be a recurring, ongoing issue. That and the fact that where are you going to go today as a Christian to talk about that and get help with that without feeling
It's never talked about.
Right. So when we would open the door on that subject, people would say,
Wow.
we need such help here and we don't know where to go.
Brother.
I just got done doing a marriage, 4 messages on marriage at a family camp here in California, Forest Home
Yes.
Family Camp.
Yes.
I did all 4 messages out of Philippians. Have you read Philippians?
That's what
New
is
Testament.
that part of
New Testament.
hold on. Jonathan, New Testament. Write that down, please. Thank you.
So, do you know what word is not found in the book of Philippians?
Oh goodness.
Marriage.
Okay.
It's not in there. Ephesians talks about marriage.
Okay.
1 Peter 3 talks about marriage. Genesis 2 talks about marriage. Colossians 3 talks about marriage.
Right.
Philippians, it's not there at all.
Okay.
How did I do 4 messages about marriage from the book of Philippians? The first message was about humility.
Okay.
Have this mind in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. Although he saw himself as being equal with God, he emptied himself, took on the form of a servant. So if you have that in mind, if in your marriage, what you're saying to one another
Yes.
is, you're more important than me. Philippians 2:3, do nothing from selfishness. The Greek word for nothing means nothing. Do nothing from selfishness.
Crazy.
You could take those 4 words, do nothing from selfishness. You apply that in your marriage, that'll take care of 80% of the problem. I tell people all the time, when you're struggling with humility, go back to the cross. When you're struggling with anything, go back to the cross, see what Christ has done for you. And if that doesn't birth in you a passion to want to empty yourself, lay down your life for him, then you haven't considered the cross.
No.
I heard Larry Crabb, who was an author and a counselor, he said, if you don't think Jesus and the gospel is the answer to the problem you're facing, you have not correctly understood the problem you're facing.
That is so perfectly worded. Yes.
Isn't that, and I pulled over the side and I wrote that down.
Yeah, perfectly worded.
Because I said, yes, we think our problem is X, Y, and Z. Our problem is there's a gospel issue. If we can get the gospel issue right, that'll fix the problem. So, first message is on humility. Second message with this group is on unity. So Paul talks in this about make my joy complete by being of the same mind, unite, intent on one purpose. So he desires unity in the body of Christ. Well, where does that start? At home, being one, unity, oneness in marriage. It's why and what does that unity mean? It doesn't mean sameness. It doesn't mean you think like me or I think like you. It means both of us put ourselves under the authority of Scripture, and we are united together in our response to Scripture as our authority. That's what unity looks like in a marriage. So if you want to pursue unity, you pursue unity by saying, let's agree that this is our standard and we're going to pursue that as our source of unity.
Yeah.
My third message to this group was about what do you do when conflict comes?
Right.
Because Euodia and Syntyche in Philippi were at each other, and Paul says, and imagine being Euodia and Syntyche, and you're sitting in the Philippian church and they're reading this letter for the first time and they're talking about unity and love and humility, and then all of a sudden it says, by the way, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to get along with each other. And you're sitting there going, wait, he's calling us out? Paul in this letter to the church calling us out by name? How would you like to have your name in the Bible for centuries and that's what you're known for?
Right, not
the
good.
one who didn't get along with Syntyche.
Not good.
But then he goes on and he says, so yeah, you got to work this out. And by the way, rejoice in the Lord. So yes, you're sideways with each other, and that's left hurt and bitter. But you got to learn how to rejoice in the Lord and how to take your anxiety and your stress to the Lord in everything.
Is this still part of point 3?
This yeah.
Okay, I want to guess point 4, but so keep going.
This is me just saying, here are principles in Philippians about how human beings are to apply the gospel in these situations.
And this is here's what I love. This is at a marriage
Talking about
conference.
marriage.
I love it.
So what do you think my fourth thing was?
So I was going to go for the somewhere related to the anxiety part where but I thought, well, that doesn't really punch it out. I mean, it's got to be.
I went backward. I
you
went
went
to
backwards.
chapter 3.
Oh.
Philippians chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where Paul says, you have to forget what lies behind. And so many couples I've come in contact with are paralyzed in their current marriage because they can't let go of the sins
it's
of the
precious,
past.
brother. That is precious.
Or because they are puffed up in pride about the past, and they have to know how to deal appropriately with the past. And Paul says, I put all of that behind me, and I'm pressing on to this one goal. I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his suffering. I want to know this. So I'm saying to these couples, all of this stuff from the past that is paralyzing your relationship, you have to learn how to apply the gospel to your past.
Yeah.
Really believe
Amen.
that you've been forgiven.
Yes.
Really believe that you're being transformed and
Yes.
that you have a hope and a future. When that's your foundation, now you can come back and you can press on together. Now, I say all of that. So here's that broad brush that I just painted with. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And you didn't ask this, he said, but I'll tell you the second one.
Yeah.
Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Then he says this, all of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, all of it can be summed up in those two things. Everything in the Old Testament, it's either about how you love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, or how you love your neighbor as yourself. And then the question was, well, who's my neighbor? And he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Your neighbor is a person who you see who is in need, and you have the resources to help them. Well, who is the person in my life who I see most often in need that I have the resources to help?
I'm going to say the half of your one flesh.
It's my wife.
Yes.
So if I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, my nearest neighbor most often is my wife.
Yeah.
And if all of the law and the prophets is either about me loving God or loving my neighbor, now when I read my Bible and I see about how I'm to love my neighbor, I think my first neighbor is my wife. I have to apply this in marriage. And in fact, if I can apply it in marriage, I can apply it anywhere. Because the hardest place to apply it is marriage. It's easier to love my next door neighbor than it is to love my wife.
Totally.
Right? But if I can learn how to love my wife,
Yes.
my next door neighbor is a piece of cake, no matter how obnoxious my next door neighbor is.
I can fool my next door neighbor to think I'm a nice guy. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where I'm coming back and
love
saying,
it.
when you say theology is, yes, loving your neighbor as yourself, which is what half of the Bible's about.
Yeah.
When we learn how to love God and love our neighbor, your marriage is going to be fine if you can do those two things.
That is precious. Okay, then I guess to wrap it all up then, after so many years of conducting interviews as you did, was there ever a time you thought, gee, I'm interviewing all these people and they're kind of the focal point of attention, where there must have been times you're going, you know what, I think I've got more profound things to say than that.
So Dennis Rainey and I would both tell you that there were times in interviews where we were talking to people and it dawned on us that we knew more about what we were asking them questions about than they did. And there were times you'll go back and you'll listen and you go, you guys kind of took over the interview and just started having the conversation between the two of you.
That you and Dennis would.
And we did that when we got in there and went, honestly, we can answer these questions better than the guests we invited on could.
So then on that note, again, I promise I'm wrapping it up here. With you and Dennis for so many years together, suppose someone goes off the rails theologically. I mean, that must have happened many times. How do you reel that back in?
Well, that's why we edited the program. We did.
Got it.
There were things where we were having the interview and I'm looking at my engineer who is looking at me with these eyes like, what are you going to do with what this guest is saying?
Yeah.
And so you're
getting looks from the engineer going, hey, Bob, do something here.
I would go like this.
Okay.
Okay. And I would go that. And that meant we're going to cut this later. So this is the scissors over here.
Was this
so
just to put his mind at ease?
When I put my fingers up like that, he knew you're saying we're going to edit this out later. Don't worry about it. If we even wind up using this interview, we'll edit around this.
If we even wind up using. So okay, were there other times you did a full recording? You and Dennis are like, hey, Bob, there's just nothing here?
In 28 years of doing Family Life Today, I think there may have been 2 or 3 interviews that we didn't use at all. Okay. Some of that's just because you do your homework so that you don't get in those situations.
Fair enough.
There were other programs that we got done doing, and we say, we're going to schedule that on the Monday of Labor Day, when we knew that there would be fewer people listening than there might be on another day.
That is so brilliant. Brother, thank you so much, my friend. This was great. Okay, now This was you said 10,000 hours? Is that what I need?
Right.
Okay, I'm about 2 hours and 20 minutes now. How am I doing? Give me a word. Give me a critique.
Amazing. You are so far ahead of the curve. Well done, man.
You're
Bless
the
you.
best, brother.